Great to see you. Okay.
All right.
You want to click got it?
Got it. Okay.
So we will just go ahead and get started, even though a few more people will probably trickle in, but we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves and just talk a little bit about who we are and what we're doing here at Kenyon. So I direct the integrated program in Humane Studies, which, as you may know, is the oldest interdisciplinary program here at Kenyon. And I've been here about 18 years. When I came, we had 100 students in our introductory course, very much great books, history of ideas. And over the years, those numbers have trickled down to 50, and now we're at a good 32. We're actually doing pretty well compared to a lot of other schools, but we don't have those huge numbers that we had when we first started teaching. And over the years, I began to wonder how we could attract more students to the humanities and really switch it up, which is where Professor Chun comes in. This is Jon Chun, and you can introduce yourself, I guess.
No, sure. So we actually moved from the Bay Area. I was a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. I did my last startup. Well, I was actually a director of development at Symantec, the largest computer security company. But before that, I did a series of startups, and the last one was acquired. Very interesting. It was one of our funders was Incutel, the CIA's venture fund, and we've done all sorts of interesting things. Typical entrepreneur. I've had a seat at law school. I was in medical school. I did research. I'm an electrical engineer. I worked in the National Physics Lab. So I think we complement each other very well because you also have a very diverse background in the humanities.
Yeah. And your last startup was funded by Incutel, the CIA, and Wall Street. And
Wall Street hedge funds.
So he sold that and retired for a nice 10 years while I worked diligently with our humanities program. And as digital humanities, this field kind of became popular about 6-7 years ago. John said to me, well, maybe you guys could do some interesting computational stuff. And I was a little skeptical because at that point, not much had really been done that was very good. And I said, all my colleagues say this stuff is really boring. And he said, how do they know? How do they know? Because now computers can do these amazing things. And so what we decided is we wanted to put together a course that we felt like every Kenyon student should take. And this was really your impotence. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is my last startup, we had about 50% of our programmers were Caltech CS majors. The other 50% were postdocs in theoretical physics from IIT and Moscow Theoretical Institute, Yale. Very high-powered intellectual team. But as we see, I've seen in my life, I'm 55, technology actually escape from the lab and kind of proliferate throughout society. I think it represents a great existential threat to humanity. And I think we need to have a more diverse set of voices at the table. I think we need to, and when I watched, what you teach, and I said, this is exactly the kind of moral, intellectual, kind of cultural grounding that anyone involved in the discussion about, autonomous killing weapons or social media, censoring or, automation and job elimination. Like how is society collectively going to address all of the challenges that society is posing for us?
Yeah, the technology. And
Yeah.
you used to say we should not let the engineers
make
all these decisions.
Not alone. Not alone.
Not alone. And so this is really a big questions course. This is our 200 level, so it's a sophomore course. And do you want to show the site here? Do you want to present it?
Sure.
And we'll just show you the kinds of things that we decided together. You want this one right here.
Okay.
So we're going to go to our course website here.
You're going to go to the website?
Yeah,
first.
we're going to go to the website.
Okay, I have to.
It's right here.
I know, but you pointed me to the.
Sorry. Technical glitch here.
Desktop screen. Okay.
Okay.
So this is our course.
This is our 200. We also have a 300 level course called AI for the Humanities, which is the first AI humanities course in the world. But this is our 200 level that is where we kind of synthesize everything that we really feel like Kenyon students need to know for the 21st century. So go ahead and talk about how to
And so we won't go into detail. This is a 14-week course. And we talk about every week is paired a core technology with a related social issue. And so we talk about are we data? So Yuval Harari, you may have heard of him, but that's the one we'll go into depth here. But we also talk about, we synthesize neuroscience and physics and philosophy, storytelling, UI, design, interconnecting humanity, network effects, social media. We talk about cyber war, just war. What is just war in the context of cyber warfare, Stuxnet virus? And it's not superficial. One of the things I had a problem with at Berkeley, I did take an ethics course, but I can tell you that it was very watered down. You know, it's kind of, it pleases neither the technical nor the humanist. So what we try to do is bring rigor on both sides. So we have a unique class. We have mathematicians, we have physicists, we have economists on one end, and on the other end, we have studio art, we have dance majors, we have drama majors, English majors. And we've heard this, that from our students, they've never been in a course with as many diverse majors, and some and people on the sciences say they would never take an English course, they were too intimidated. And we've had people say, I never imagined I'd take a computer science or a stat class.
We do teach coding alongside this, so we'll just open up the matter and information. We start out, this is pretty deep, actually. It may not seem like it. But let me just start with this quote. This is by Scott Page, and we do teach some work from the model thinker. And this really got me thinking, this is really the key question to me about what education should look like for the 21st century. Page writes, we live in an age of abundant information. A century and a half ago, knowing information brought great economic and social status. Jane Austen's Emma asks if Frank Churchill is a young man of information. Today, she would not care. Churchill, like everyone else, would have a smartphone. The question is whether he could put that information to use. As Fyodor Dostoevsky writes in Crime and Punishment, we've got facts, they say, but facts aren't everything. At least half the battle consists in how one makes use of them. So really, to me, the question is, we know that education should not be about conveying information. We know that it's no longer a question of knowing the right stuff, right? Because we all have smartphones. The real issue is we're swimming in information. And how do we develop skills to seek out the information that we need? And it strikes me that really we need to rethink education about how to deal with this abundant information. And that's very much what we try to do in this course.
And there's one unifying theme that goes to this course. It's really a data-driven way to think critically, to analyze information. And that involves everything from statistical paradoxes to cognitive biases to propaganda methods. This week, we're talking about data journalism and how to critique that.
So we start by building on Plato. Each week, we do kind of touch back on things that are in the first year course. So one week we talk about, we read this article called How Aristotle Invented the Computer. And we look at the long history of computer science that dates back to philosophers, Leibniz, Descartes, all of, the birth of linguistics, all of these things build. This week, when we really start out, we ask, how do we know what we know, right? And we talk about perception. And we try as much as possible to get students to consistently compare human versus machine, because there are problems with human perception, but they're quite different from the problems with how computers deal with data, right? And so here we explicitly compare. In the week on language, we compare artificial versus natural languages. So we also teach information theory, and this is Claude Shannon, and as you may know, it's actually pretty tricky. The entropy and
it is. Well, again, this is where it gets kind of very philosophical. Is that people think information is just something out there, an inert raw resource like Plato. And what we try to give the students appreciation for is that information may be the fundamental reality, more elemental than matter or energy or space. And there are physicists who actually make that argument. But one of the ways to do that is to actually look at some of the internal structure. Entropy, for example, and information theory is a way to look at information with a new lens and a new appreciation.
What's in another week when we talk about consciousness, and would we even want, if we create AI, to make it conscious? Probably not. But could we even do that? What's really interesting to me now is mathematicians, physicists, everybody's getting in on the game and trying to understand consciousness. And one reason is that they think if we can understand consciousness, we might actually be able to understand reality better. And that is linked to this notion that information might be the ground reality. So Fridays, we have our big discussion about these concepts. And the really tricky question is, first of all, are we data, right? Biological data? Are we the data that is collected about us, right? So there's even been the argument that an algorithm will know you better than your spouse, than your best friend, with a certain number of clicks, right? And what is not quantifiable? But we also read Harari this week, who argues that dataism is our new God. He replaces older ways of thinking about how to make decisions that could be logic, feelings, religion, and dataism. Instead, the algorithm decides, right? So what's really interesting, I don't know, do you want to say
Well,
anything about
he brings up an interesting conversation we had last 2 weeks ago on this subject. Was in the future, with big data, with these very sophisticated models, with AI models that can, create models of your cognition, of your whole being, as you said, better than anyone else would know, is that discrimination won't be based on race or class or gender. It will be based on you. We'll be able to slice the data cube so finely that you will be discriminated just for who you are. What is in your 23andMe genomic profile? How many, single nucleotide polymorphisms that you have that basically leads to a risk model that you're not worth hiring. Or maybe they'll take a function, maybe they'll take a brain scan of you. That'll be a condition for employment. And looking at your brain, some researchers say is more accurate than any kind of battery of psychometric tests.
So one of the things we've found with the humanists, and I don't disagree with them, is the desire to reject all of this. All right. I mean, dataism sounds terrible. Let's stop collecting data. But in fact, it's going to happen anyway. And one of the reasons why we teach AI to our humanists is because people will develop it, whether we tell them to or not. And so what we really want to do is prepare students to have a seat at the table, and not just a seat of critique, but a seat that suggests, here's what we keep, here's how we program humanity into our tools, and here's what we absolutely need to limit or regulate or address.
And I can tell you, because I do keep tabs on what's going on in Silicon Valley still, is that one of the hottest areas right now is fairness, accuracy, transparency, explainability. People in Silicon Valley, they're entrepreneurs. They don't want to create malformed or unjust or racially biased models. They just need guidance. And they would, in a heartbeat, hire some of our students if they were educated and they could help guide toward a more humane, a more just, a more legal, model, a business model or AI model.
Let's talk about some of the student projects here. Okay. So we just have a very few examples. Every single student ends each of our courses with a project. You can see a lot of their posters up on Digital Kenyon. And we really ask them to connect their major, their passion, their interest with what they're learning in class. So this is Michael's project. You want to talk about what he did?
Yes, and so Michael was a political science major, and so he was interested. He was taking a class in transitional justice, and so we introduced a lot of natural language processing. How can computers help you analyze all of these speeches? So he went back over decades of UN speeches, the open sessions where every country gets to basically put a stake in the ground and kind of say where their country's policy is. And what he did is he applied some natural language processing, and he did k-means clustering to actually see if he could find out how the world is polarized based upon these opening speeches. And he broke the world down into, well, the data actually did it, not him. So the data actually showed that there were two polarities in the world. One was kind of the Western democracies talking about human rights and rules of law. And then on the other hand, he saw a cluster of Russia, China, Venezuela, and Cuba, and they were talking about national rights and actually, surprisingly, justice. And so again, this is what we try to teach in our class, that the AI is a golem. All models are wrong, some are useful. These are dumb models. They're very powerful and they can be misused. There always needs to be a human in the loop.
But the other thing I'll say, that's
someone who can interpret it.
Really fascinating right now is, first of all, a huge majority of the data that we now have that's being produced is unstructured. Right? Yeah. I said 80, you said it's even more than that. Yeah. So this is linguistic. This is text, it's image, it's video, it's sound. And we now have these tools created by, well, we use one created by OpenAI that we'll show you in a minute. But a lot of these natural language processing tools that were created by industry But now our students can use them for free to actually look at these large corpora of linguistic data. In this case, we also do all different, sound, video. So what's really cool is we now have all this data that is our cultural product. And we also have these new tools. Now they are created often in industry. We get to use them for free. Some of our students at first are hesitant, right? Because they are tools of capitalism, but we do try to repurpose them for good means in our class and for students to do cool things. And here's another one. This is a student who worked on Nabokov's Pale Fire, which we used to teach in an upper division IPHS class. This text by Nabokov is notoriously difficult, and there is almost no good criticism. And she used a method that we have just finished a book with Cambridge University Press on, which allows us to surface a shape in stories. And it does that not by tracking plot, which it turns out is really difficult. We still can't do it, but by tracking the language of emotion. This is something called sentiment analysis. In this case, what's really fascinating is the book by Nabokov is really tricky. It's a poem by a fictional poet, and then the commentary by another character. And the commentary is all footnotes. And so the real question was, does this commentary have anything to do with the poem, or is it a mad scholar who thinks crazy things about the poem? And what she found, she had a brilliant idea. This actually ended up, we talk about her both, we have it at conferences, but also in the book. What she found is she divided it in half, and each one had a very, very similar emotional arc, almost like a mirror image. And mirrors and reflections are huge in this book. And so you can see on the left and the right, they're almost these mirror images. It was really a fantastic idea. And we'll show you a little bit more about that technique in a moment. And then let's talk about Jack's project. This was a great project. Yeah.
Okay, and so Jack was he was interested in environmental studies. He's very interested.
Well, he was a class assistant complex.
Yeah, class assistant.
But he was very interested in the environment. So
he was very interested, and so he was working, I believe, something on campus with lead certification for, or at least a student participation in some lead certification projects, and he got curious about the process, and so. The whole certification process, there are several dimensions upon which you're evaluated. And he was critiquing it from a data-driven perspective. And one of the things he found out was that there's a way to game it. That it's that five of the 6 categories were pretty pro forma. You just had to kind of do the paperwork and jump through. One was actually, for example, very difficult to do, and that was carting off or ecologically somehow doing with the construction materials like the cement, the concrete, and things like that. And that had the biggest impact from his studies. And so he found like he was actually thinking of ways to come up with a better, more economically sound basis for green buildings. And one of the things he was interested in from a little entrepreneur standpoint is he started going into looking into creating an alternative construction materials, because that seemed to be the biggest damage to the environment.
Right, that people are hauling these construction materials from long distances, and that has the largest environmental impact.
Yeah.
So when he looked at this with the LEED certification, what he found is that most people fudge that.
Yeah.
That you can still be LEED certified when in fact you have a huge environmentally negative impact because you're sourcing materials from far away.
So he did research, and he said, yeah, there are alternative building materials that actually have less of an impact, despite what the LEED certification says. And so we looked at this mud brick technology, and he did a fair amount of research into it. And there were some companies in Italy and Australia, but unfortunately, it's limited to kind of Mediterranean type climates. Yeah. But every failure is kind of one step closer to a success.
Yeah,
it was a great project.
Really great project. Yeah. Okay, and so let's go ahead and show them a little bit about the kinds of research that our students are doing. So you want to advance here?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So one thing that we teach them is that method of finding the shapes of stories. So this is Kurt Vonnegut, and he does this. I don't know if we have time to play. Well, sure, you guys can watch Kurt Vonnegut.
Do we have time?
Well, should we go on? Well, we want to do the AI.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you want, look it up on YouTube. Vonnegut was trying to get a PhD at University of Chicago, and actually in anthropology, and he tried to write this for his thesis, and they rejected him because it was not academic enough. And so he ended up, of course, becoming the writer that we all love. And so it had a happy ending. But now we are working. Now we can actually prove what he wanted to say in in his thesis, which is that all these stories actually have shapes. And so he talks about that in this. So we'll show you the research that's come since then. Oh, this is how it works. Do you want to talk about how it works?
Yeah, and so what it is it's a time series analysis of emotion in a book or novel, over maybe UN speeches, whatever it could be, a whole corpora of movie scripts.
We had somebody compare Trump and Cuomo speeches on COVID. And so that poster is actually up if you're interested. Yeah, anyway, yeah.
So what they do is they take some body of text, in this case a novel, and chop it up into kind of comparable units. And in each unit, they do a sentiment analysis. And there are a variety of ways of doing it. The simplest one is which there's a lexicon, a dictionary of words like wonderful, terrific, ecstatic, which will have like a positive polarity. And then the terrible, horrible, abominable, that'll have negative. And it'll be anywhere from 1 to 5 or something like that. They're much more sophisticated, but this is the most simplistic one. And for each one of those, each chunk of text is assigned a polarity, and then kind of like a stock price or something like a temperature, environmental temperature gauge in the North Pole. You get this time series of things going up and down, and you kind of feel the momentum, of the emotion in the story, not necessarily the plot, but the emotion.
No, the emotion. And we've had students do this on Toni Morrison's Beloved that she was reading for another class, George Eliot's Middlemarch, as you saw Nabokov. We have one student who's very curious about whether Emily Wilson's new translation of Homer's Odyssey, which she'd been reading for a different class, was different from earlier translations. So she actually compared the emotional arc of translations over time and found changes. And also the student who did that amazing job to see if young adult novels for women coming of age had changed over time. She just selected a few, so we need to know more about all kinds of.
We had a student who it was triggered. He'd get into arguments with his father about how music has gone to crap compared to his father's generation. So he actually collected a whole bunch of lyrics from the 60s and 70s and compared it to contemporary, and basically
that was actually curse words though, and
yes.
he did admit that his father was right. So I felt like we had done something good for Kenyon parents. Okay, so another class that I tried teaching is called Storylab, because we have so many students who want to write. But I thought I would try a new approach, which is to take all of this that we know about what makes successful novels and narratives. And here are 2 great books that you can read. And of course, it doesn't tell you what to do, but we could use those same computational tools to analyze their own stories. In particular, we tried to have students create those emotional arcs. So they wrote narrative, and then they actually tried to surface their own emotional arc, and we used that to edit. Here you can see it actually made the Atlantic, the 6 main arcs in storytelling as identified by an AI. This is a group out of University of Vermont. Our work has really been about not looking at the kind of general shapes, but about how each story has its own unique fingerprint. And so our students are much more interested in going into a much more granular look. And I guess we could show that.
Yeah, and there's no magic here. This is not prescriptive. This is
about
descriptive.
how to write a bestseller.
Yeah, so it's not going to write a bestseller. The ETS, it's interesting. They do a first pass on essays looking for coherence.
Some of these methods.
Some of these methods.
Yeah.
So,
and this is the group out of the University of Vermont. So they did Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. And I think the headline was really false. It was like, why we all love Harry Potter. Of course, this is not, you can't say that because of this art.
And so the interesting thing is, if you look at the peaks and valleys of these sentiment curves, they actually correspond to what we as readers would interpret as key points in the novel.
Yeah, this was actually a colleague in English was very upset by this, because it does seem to suggest she felt that all of our hard work, picking out those key moments that we talk about in our literature class could be automated. But, my feeling is that this actually suggests that there's things happening in the text that we haven't paid enough attention to. And in particular, that we haven't paid enough attention to the way the language of emotion is helping us identify those key moments.
And again, none of this is to replace the human. Yeah. There always has to be a human expert, domain expert involved in this, whether it's medical decisions or whether it's, literary novels.
Yeah.
We spent all summer looking at dozens of novels from over 1,000 years, different genres, and 36 models from the very simple to most complex. And they're all wrong in their own unique way.
And it requires a lot of analysis.
It requires a lot of human.
Do the graph and say, okay, yes. I know what's happening. Usually, the Nabokov was So here are some of the kind of general shapes that the Storylab in the University of Vermont found. And as you can see, actually, each story is slightly different. I mean, if you stand far enough away, you can say they all share similar shapes, but it's that more individual shape that we're interested in our classes. And here you can see ones that we've taught with students and that we've mapped. This is called, I call it Storyteller Curves. The other researchers call them bestseller curves, but we find these curves going up and down, a positive and negative emotion in stories across time, including Homer's Odyssey, as I'll show you. So they're really not limited to bestsellers, and these are just storyteller curves that you can find in something like Robinson Crusoe. Here you can see these storyteller curves in the Odyssey, in The Great Gatsby, and these are the more granular. You can see they're spikier, so I'm calling them curves, but this is really the unique fingerprint of the novel. And I call these curves on a hill. This is Great Expectations that we had a student work on. All of our students learn to do this, but the focus is really on analysis. How does it help me see the novel differently?
Yeah, and when is the model wrong?
And when is the model wrong? Because here on the right, that's a bunch of AI models, right?
That's 36 models.
Yeah, so also part of the work is to try to figure out which model is best, and it's not always the same.
It's not, yeah.
And Toni Morrison, this was really fascinating because you may be familiar with Toni Morrison's Beloved, which is about post escape from slavery. And what's really fascinating is these two high points, those two peaks that you see, those are actually memories of slavery, right? Well, actually, the first is escape right after the escape from slavery, but the second one is actually a memory of slavery. And then there are these moments descending, what I call tragic curves. And one of the peaks is actually the moment when the character kills her child in order to prevent her child from being taken into slavery. So Toni Morrison is doing really, really unusual things here as the characters work through the effects of slavery. And the student who began working on this, and we finished, and this also ended up in the book with Cambridge, just really amazing work to help us understand how Morrison is shaping the emotional experience of the novel. Okay, and so now we get into the interactive. So
before was descriptive. What we're trying to describe writing using AI. This is generative. Now we're actually using more current AI models.
So one of the cool things is a couple years ago, as we were already well into many years of teaching our courses, a new AI came out. This is a transformer model. You may have seen it in the news. They actually printed stories written by GPT-2 and then GPT-3, which we're now working with. And this changed everything, because before AI, language generation was what you like to call a word salad. I mean, it was really junk. And when this came out, it just completely blew our mind. So GPT-2 is a smaller model. Would you want to explain? It's just fed tons of language. We give it no rules.
So, I did my graduate work in cognitive science. So a lot of it is they take these models, neural nets, deep neural nets, and they're able to, they train it on billions of words, English words, filtered, selected for quality. And like a human being, they just statistically wind up building these neural connections and forming these latent, these associations. And they internalize how to do things they've never been trained to do. For example, they will be able to make acronyms, even though they've never been explicitly programmed. They'll be able to translate things. They'll be able to
They
add
can do it
and
already.
subtract.
They do it already.
Yeah, so just by being exposed to billions of examples of the English language, they were able to kind of infer and extract these patterns out.
So we've had students use the older model GPT-2. You can actually train it. So we have had students train it to write Sex and the City scripts, Rick and Morty, a Rocky Horror Picture Show, Chekhov,
lyrics,
song lyrics. You can find all of these
poems
on Digital Kenyon. Write like Faulkner. And part of their work is really to go in and establish metrics. What can it do well? What can it not? One student did an MTV show called Daria, and it got characters very, very right. It got scenes very right.
The voice.
It was funny, but it did have somebody stirring lasagna and picking up the phone twice in a row without hanging up. So it made kind of silly mistakes, but it was actually pretty good. So
you'll see how good it is.
You'll see. But, so this is GPT-3, and we've had several students working with GPT-3 this past semester. Now, the thing about GPT-3 is it was deemed so dangerous that OpenAI refused to release it publicly. because they're worried about fake news. And so can people even, or is it still, we're part of a group of researchers that are using it by invitation only. So our students are really lucky because they get to work with it. So this was Catherine Jones, who studies film and is also doing creative writing in English. And she wanted to see, develop some metrics about how well it could write. So now we're going to open it up to you all. This is her prompt, and this is all we give the AI. And the first question I have is, what would be hard for an AI? What does the AI need to understand? Because remember, we've not given this AI any knowledge. It's read a lot. It's had tons of language. But what would it be hard for it? And then I want to ask you, like, how easy would it be for you to write the next few sentences? And usually when we taught it this summer at OSU, we did actually ask students to do that. Okay, so here is the prompt. And then I don't know if you want to unmute if you have ideas, or if you want to talk in chat. We would love to hear what you think would be hard for an AI. What would an AI not know, or what would it have to know? The ocean was inky and still, which wouldn't have been unusual on its own. But that night, when they pulled up the nets, there was a person crashing inside them instead of fish.
So the way this works is we feed this line, the starting prompt, into the GTP3 model, and then it continues the story.
So what do you think the AI would have trouble with writing this story? Does anybody want to just say what they think? What would be hard?
That there's a person thrashing inside instead of a fish.
Right, so that would be unusual. It has to understand that that's weird.
Yeah, it has to understand that a fish is for catching, or a net is for catching fish, not humans.
Yeah. So what anything else? What else would be hard?
Oh, I just wanted to say hi, everybody. The fact that the ocean was inky, and how that is a descriptor of the setting, compared to, instead of just that it's dark, and it gives a quality of the setting, not a true that it's black. It's
No,
and computers are very literal, right?
Yeah.
So it's got to know the ocean is not made of ink.
So a computational linguist would say you have syntax, which is the surface words and rules. Then you have semantics, which is the meaning underneath that. And then you have pragmatics, which is the wider common sense, everything we understand, like how physics work.
Like not stirring those.
Yeah. So when you talk about a net, you're talking about, something that's not stated, but that's pragmatic. Everybody knows that. And then when you talk about inky, that's that the author there is trying to, that evokes a certain emotion. There's a semantic to that.
We also know that the people are probably fishermen, right? We know that they're probably on a boat.
Oh yeah, it's not said.
None of this is said, right? And the story has to focus on what's in the net. So the AI has to know not to talk more about the ocean or the night, but not to do that.
From an information theory, from a computer science, mathematical program, this is called a grossly underspecified problem in that there's so much meaning that's not contained in those words.
Okay, so she wrote 2, the AI wrote 2, and we're just going to read through them. And you decide AI or human, but the real question is why? What's the tell, and how do you know? Because that's what we're trying our students to figure out. Because if we know what the tell is, then we can program the AI. We can eventually teach the AI to do a better job. So go ahead. You want to read? You're good at reading. So all right.
So the ocean was inky and still, which wouldn't have been unusual on its own. But that night, when they pulled up the nets, there was a person thrashing inside them instead of fish. Well, the first mate said. The second mate stood up with the knife he used to slice open the nets, but the captain was already standing next to him with a gun. Don't be a fool, the captain said. The man inside the net wasn't moving. He was just lying there on the deck, his hair tangled in the netting, his face pale and sunken. He looked like he had been in the water for weeks. We should throw him back, the first mate said. The captain turned the gun on him. You're not throwing anything back, he said. He's ours now. Captain Locke looked at the other 2 men and grinned. The first mate and the second mate grinned back. It wasn't often that the captain smiled.
Okay, so we're not going to tell you yet, but just curious, what is a clue? Anybody want to hazard a guess on AI or human, and why? Like the real question is why? How can you tell?
Yeah, and again, to put this back into practical context, we taught this last semester, and when you get these, what we call poker tells, that enables us to establish metrics, which allows us to detect fake news or
Yeah.
trolls
Yeah.
or improve the model. So we need some feedbacks.
Yeah.
If we're going to move the ball of the needle for humanity or any of these things, we have to critique this, but
Yeah.
in ways that are constructive.
Okay, so human or AI? Who wants to take a stab? And how do you know? Why?
My only clue was the person in the net was thrashing and then had lower down, all of a sudden they're laying still on the deck.
Mhm.
That was the only, I mean, the rest kind of felt like any kind of novel you could read about fishermen.
Yeah, so the man inside the net wasn't moving. What's happened? There seems to be a non sequitur there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to the next
But,
one.
but
Yeah,
that could
okay.
that could be a authorial choice, like
Could be.
suddenly went limp because he was pulled aboard the whatever.
Okay, read our next one.
Okay. The ocean was inky and still, which wouldn't have been unusual on its own, but that night when they pulled up the nets, there was a person thrashing inside them instead of fish. Two of the men on the boat tried to pull it out, but it was a woman and she fought them. They had to tie her down with nets and ropes, and even then she was ferocious. Then one of them had a knife. He cut her throat. The blood poured into the ocean, and they watched it turn black as it mixed with the water. The woman was dead, but they all noticed she was pale as the moon. The men on the boat looked at each other. What the heck? They had a whole boat full of fish. It would take days to get all the fish to market, so they decided to keep the body. They wrapped her in a tarp and rigged a pulley system and used the nets to keep her from drifting away. The next day, when they pulled in the nets, the body was gone, but they only found pieces of her arms and legs. Then they started seeing her. At first, they thought it was just their eyes playing tricks on them, shadows in the water, nothing more. But then they started seeing her every night and knew they were seeing a ghost.
Okay, what's your guess? AI or human? What do we got here? No one's gonna vote? Silence? Sarah has silenced you. Does that mean you think it's human?
Why?
Because I think it all follows together better than the other one did.
Yeah, it's better. So possibly human, we'll say. Okay, so let's do this number 3.
Number 3. The ocean was inky and still, which wouldn't have been unusual on its own, but that night when they pulled up the nets, there was a person thrashing inside them instead of fish. The rest of the crew quickly gathered around the net, and they were all too stunned to say anything at first. Petros was the first to find his voice. "What in the name of the almighty Poseidon is that?" he whispered. "I don't know, but it's a man," the captain said. "A trapped man." The captive man was moving wildly, trying to free himself, but his struggles were futile. The more he fought, the more entangled he became. "We have to do something," said a sailor. "We cannot let him drown like this." Petros nodded and moved to the side of the boat. He tried to untangle the man, but the man was thrashing so much that it was just making the situation worse. "I'm not going to be able to."
Okay, human or
So
yeah.
let me make another comment here that these are not filtered. These were the first.
Well, with the AI ones
Yeah.
and the human, both
Yeah.
were the first ones.
So oftentimes you'll see that people will generate like 50 of these and pick the top 4. We generated 4. These were the first 4, right?
2 human, 2 AI.
Oh yeah. Of the AI ones, we did not filter these. So that makes it all the more stunning that we
But
didn't.
we didn't filter the human.
No, we
Okay,
didn't
go
filter
next
all
one.
the AI ones.
Next one.
Okay,
let's just
so
go.
the last one. The ocean was inky and still, which wouldn't have been unusual on its own. But that night when they pulled up the nets, there was a person thrashing inside them instead of fish. It was a boy. He was no older than 5, his body a dark shadow in the moonlight. His eyes were closed and his head lolled backwards, and for a moment Bikram thought he was dead. But then he opened his eyes. His irises were charcoal and perfectly round, and his mouth was wide open in a silent cry. "Get him out of the net!" Amrita shouted. Bikram threw his weight into the wet ropes. They were heavy, and the catch was large. He yanked a knife out of his belt and cut the net open, then pulled the boy out. The boy's chin rested on Bikram's shoulder, and the fisherman could feel his heat against his skin. He wrapped his arms around the boy's ribs and back, holding him close to his chest. "My name is Bikram," he said. He turned to the other fishermen and called for them to tie the boat to the dock. He turned back to the boy and said, I'm going to take care of you. No, the boy started to struggle, windmilling his arms as the boat rocked back and forth. Don't.
Okay, I'm curious, what do you guys think of this one?
I think the part I'm struggling with is whether an AI would make something feel more human by making up character names or not. Because the last two had character names, the first two did not.
Yeah.
So the character name strikes you, yeah, as maybe something that an AI wouldn't know. I mean, we had no names in that beginning.
Right.
So would it know to create names? Is there anything else? I'm curious, is there anything else in this one that feels particularly human to anybody? Like there's no way an AI could do it. Yeah.
I sort of feel that the pacing with which information is revealed in this sounds human, sounds authorial in the way of a human. So that's something that makes me wonder whether this might be a human. And it's also the kind of dialogue components of it, and the choice to move into dialogue is characteristic of a lot of authors, obviously. Now, whether the AI could have figured that out from all it's been fed, I don't know. But that's what makes this feel human to me.
Yeah, so this, for our Kenyon students, this was the one that they felt was most human, that they liked best as a story. But he kind of gave it away. He kind of gave it away when you said four. They're all four actually the AI. I'm sorry, we tricked you. Terrible that we are. But they were the very first four stories generated. We picked the exact number of words it generates. That's why they're this length. But there was no editing and they were spit out within seconds, right? So, and then if you just want to show, and then we'll open it up for a conversation. If people want to find our work, this is some of our earlier work, and we talk about students in our class and the kinds of experiments they did. This is in the Journal of Cultural Analytics, and then we have another piece coming out in the journal Narrative soon. And it's really exciting because students get to do this research, and we actually present their research at conferences, and we talk about all the students, and they make it into our books. And so, you know, in the humanities, it's been very hard to involve students in research because a lot of times you have to do years of reading in order to really be able to write. And so it's really just so exciting. Oh, and this is our Dingbat. We worked with a Denison professor. This is on YouTube and also over at Denison, where we actually did a dialogue, an improv dialogue with an actress. She's in Curb Your Enthusiasm. You may recognize her. So, but anyway, let's stop sharing and let's take questions and talk about it. I hope you didn't play. Yeah. Okay. You want to stop presenting? So happy to open it up to questions about the AI or the courses that we're doing or the student work or anything.
It's probably different from when you were at Kenyon.
But it's still, you know, it's the big questions. You know, what is language? How does language work? What does it mean to be creative?
Oh yeah, we have a student giving a talk at the art gallery, the new
about
gallery,
AI art.
about AI and what does it mean to be creative and intellectual property.
Yeah.
So I have a question. So my daughter, she loves languages, and I explained to her, I'm like, you should take a coding class. You know, you should try. So how are you attracting students that, you know, are interested in languages and helping them to see the connectivity or the opportunities in this? And then also, what kind of scaffolds do you need to put in place to help them get past that fear of computers and the technology?
Right. Well, we're lucky because we count as a quantitative reasoning course. And so we actually get a lot of students in that way who just suddenly see that they can do quantitative with something like the humanities. And that's very exciting. But I will say that I taught French at UC Berkeley for years before I came here. And I do think that coding is taught wrong or incorrectly. And I have been trying to incorporate what I used teaching French into teaching an artificial language for sure.
Yeah.
And
I love languages too. I took the foreign service exam in Spanish. I took the Japanese equivalent of the TOEFL. And so it is this beautiful kind of synthesis. And I will say that we do strongly believe that computer science and stats, a lot of things turn off a lot of people. And one of the reasons why we're not a traditional computer science program is we do ask the big questions. And I've seen over my four decades of being a programmer, how the things we do today would take hundreds, thousands of lines of code of C. And now you can just go to GitHub, bring it down, spin it up, and get a AI generating this. We actually have students who do this on their own. And so, the barriers are coming down. And to me, I would go very long on knowing genomics or literature or philosophy and go short on technology, because it's rapidly being abstracted away in the similar way that when you first bought a car in 1900, you had to be a mechanic because it would break down all the time. Now you don't have to know C. You don't have to
So OpenAI just released, and we both are part of the group of researchers working with it, but we have not unleashed it on our students yet. They have something that can code where you just speak to it and it writes code. So we will be using that in class soon. It's pretty crazy. I would say the other thing is we teach them to read code before they can write it, in the same way that you would read good poetry or literature long before you could write it. And so they do baby coding exercises, and Data Camp sponsors us. So all of our students, regardless, get free Data Camp courses. Everything is free, which is great. But you introduce like more complex code that they learn to read first. And so we have them do the parts of the code that they've learned, but then the rest they just learn to read. And we have changed it up a little bit. So we actually start with data visualization, with them actually creating beautiful graphs using code, data sets that they're interested in. So this week we did human trafficking data. And so they start wanting to see stories in the data. They start being able to visualize and code, and that gets them excited, right?
Yeah, I'm of the philosophy, and I am a programmer. I'm an engineer by training, and I don't like learning code just to code. I want to do something useful, something beautiful with it. And I think all of the students, and we're in our fifth year here, we have a dance major, and we use AI to do choreography. There's nothing that we've seen. There's no student from Kenyon, no matter what department, that hasn't brought something unique to the mix.
But it's tricky. And that's part of what we try to do is to teach it differently, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We focus on applications, interesting applications. And part of our job is to hide all the sharp corners and wires.
But also we teach natural language processing, how to create social networks, so we had one student who loved the TV show Friends, and she learned the code to actually graph the social networks, so first of all, they need to apply it. And then also working with language, just natural language processing, which traditional coding classes don't do, is just much more interesting. And Twitter, we teach them to pull down tweets and do analysis of tweets. So you've got to do it with stuff that the students are interested in, right? That's a great question.
Yeah.
Are there other questions?
I'm trying to figure out what the point of the exercise we just saw was. Yes, you've got AI that can generate the equivalent maybe of a romance novel every 15 minutes. And they're also, from the analyses you come up with, there are many ways to analyze a literary work, and many of them have some merit. Yet, are we interested in, just as kind of an intellectual exercise, in seeing whether we can get a machine to do this, or are we interested in seeing whether we can do it better? And then comes the real question: with all these analyses, does that really help the creative writer to create?
So so one of the, so every week we introduce a technology, but one of the issues we introduce with that technology is something that is hot in the press right now, which is what happens when these AIs are able to generate massive, infinite amount of quality of fake news, to be able to hijack over, social media and Twitter, and be able to, move social, public opinion. There have been studies that show that on Google and Facebook, by just moving, changing some of the search results or changing your Twitter feed, you can move independent voters 40%. Our elections are decided like by low single digits. And so it's not so much that we're trying to automate, literature, but we're trying to show them like multiple facets of it. It's kind of a little bit of a dog and pony show. But for me personally, what I'm most concerned about is, and this is why OpenAI restricted the release of this, is that unleashed, and keep in mind that we're taking a snapshot in 2021. This technology didn't even exist 3 years ago. So the progress is going very, very quickly. So I want the students to be able to, have a respectable fear of this technology and how we control it. How do we regulate? How do you think critically through it?
The automation questions are really addressed. We imagine robots in factories, but the scary part is AI is already being used to write little journal pieces. And
a lot of newspaper articles are already
newspaper
automated,
articles,
financial, sports, annual reports,
legal contracts. So, we need to think about what that means, because it used to be that if I were training somebody to be a writer, I could guarantee that. Is it a great creative writer? Actually, I have to say, teaching creative writing is very difficult for us. If I'd asked you to write the rest of that story and then we compared it. So the one thing is, it's actually very hard to say why it is an AI. And the one person who noticed that little tell, there are a few tells, and those are really important. There's a kind of analysis that goes on. But the other thing that we find, and one of the reasons we did that is just because, happy to talk about this, is because most people have no idea what this technology can do.
Or how fast it's progressing.
Or how fast. And so that's called the Turing Test, right? We did a Turing Test on you, which is basically this question of, can you tell what's human and what's AI? And it's happening even in what we consider creative intellectual tasks. In terms of literary analysis, we definitely argue for a human in the loop. What I will tell you is there are all kinds of cool new things that I see in stories that I've taught for 20 years using these tools. It's not to replace the human, it's to help me ask new questions. How does emotion serve as an engine for narrative? And if I understand that, how can I help my students write those engines, right? But it's not easy. And for sure, it's not like we saw what works for great novels and students could do it by any stretch. But the AI is most people don't understand, right? And so once you actually try to figure it out, I think it gives you a certain sense of what's happening.
And if you just think to the last election, all the media was dominated by, Russian bots or Chinese bots or other bots, basically throwing the election, and so that's not going to go away. That's going to be weaponized.
Yeah.
And we need to educate everyone.
So we had a question, IPHS is a concentration, but we do have a senior exercise, and we have 2 students who are working on an app. Do you want to talk about it, to allow people to give money directly to Venezuela?
Oh yeah.
Called the Akera. We have a lot, and each of them, they're doing project-based senior work. So we don't do the comprehensive exam. We are finding that students leave IPHS usually with 5 classes, and they have at least 3 or 4 really, really good projects. We post them on Digital Kenyon. And it really gives them an idea of things they could do other than grad school. IPHS has always placed students in the top graduate programs. Just this year, I have one starting at Yale and one at University of Chicago. That's never been hard. The hard thing is, what do the students do if they don't go get a PhD? And so this is really giving them a lot of ideas about other kinds of things.
Tell them about your student at Wyatt.
Yeah, there are. Yeah, there's still comps in. There have been some modifications, but majors do still have a lot of that. Yes.
You want to talk about the Wired students?
Yeah, I mean.
For example, you were mentioning IPHS students who don't get a PhD.
Yeah.
So you had a student.
Well, that student is going into journalism. Yeah. So more questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead, Brad.
Brad, yeah, 2 Brads.
How did we get so many Kenyon alums who are named Brad in the same discussion? Thanks so much for describing this course and your research and your publications about this. It strikes me as a really intellectually engaging and substantial and important course. So I really enjoyed that. I have a question that I think builds on the previous questions and discussion. it's going to sound critical. It isn't meant to be. It's just genuine curiosity about the projects that students do. The sample poster that you showed, I think it was Michael in political science, am I right? Analyzing the UN speeches. Have I got that right? When I skimmed, while you had it up on the screen, the conclusions there, I found those really shallow. And I don't mean to be hypercritical about that, but I'm interested in whether there's a paper, a traditional prose human authored paper that Michael did exploring the significance of those quantitative findings by different countries. And I realize no single course can do everything. I've taught my whole career for 35 years at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and I realize the limits of a course. And there's a lot in here already. But when I skimmed those conclusions, they seemed interesting. But the real interest I have is in why and what those mean, and how we'd argue about them and debate the meanings of those and the limitations of those findings and of those tools for doing that kind of analysis, and for thinking about how those different countries line up with that natural language processing. I hope that makes sense. It's a question.
So,
it's not meant to be critical of Michael at all, but it's where's the deeper thinking about those findings taking place.
So,
Thanks.
I mean, I have two responses, because I taught writing for 20 years. First 10 years at UC Berkeley and then 10 years here. And I find that our students are not prepared to write in many different forms, especially for public view, short form, et cetera. So I totally understand what you're saying about the writing. I guess what I would say is I do somewhat agree with you. We teach a course in which we are the only place where we take students who've never coded and teach them machine learning and AI, and they're coding. And it's a lot to do. And that writing is taught all over the college. And if it weren't being done, I would do it, but it is being done. What I would say to you, and this is even with our best students, is the analysis, once they're working with data, and including linguistic data, I would agree, even with the literature ones, I'm often disappointed. Of course, I have a PhD and I publish in the field, right? So are they writing what I think they should be writing? Almost never. You know, do we send them back their posters all the time and say more? Yes. But the reality is, if you look at data analytics programs where this is done traditionally, the analysis is terrible. And so I don't mean to criticize, you're not a data analyst. Okay. Anyway, you know, but the students, the analysis is really, so the question is, what are we comparing it to? I will tell you that when we go to conferences and we show people, I don't know if you have read the typical undergraduate essay. Most of those actually don't really say what I think they should be saying either. When we compare this to a more traditional approach, I feel like our students have the edge. This is a project that they do in finals week during the period of essentially a final exam. I mean, is it worthy of, you know, is it as good as it could be? Absolutely not.
Yeah, and let me also interject there, because we actually began the first class where we did the traditional 10-page, 8-page Kenyon paper that's everywhere. And it was really, they were going on autopilot. They're all beautiful writers.
You said it was just a lot of bullshit. I mean, he was very upset.
Can I interrupt for a second? Can I interrupt? I'm not suggesting that as an alternative to what you're doing. Add it on to it. And so I realize there may not be enough time to do that. That's why I said you can't accomplish everything in a single course. I understand that. But I would think of having the data analytics work done, and then the follow-up project is a limited length 4-page paper probing what those findings mean. And in prose, and really digging deeper on that and so on. And that wouldn't be some pro forma performance of some sort that students have learned to do in some other courses, just learning to think more deeply about what those findings mean.
Difficult.
It is very difficult. And one of the things we try to be sensitive to is these are non-traditional STEM people, and they're really going in. And so we actually prioritize them learning the methods, the technologies, and not hand waving. We want them, so eventually we all tell them that you're going to be a knowledge worker, most likely, whether you're a physician doing precision medicine, whether you're doing computational law as a lawyer or whatever, a professor, a voter, a writer, and you're going to be at the table, and you need to learn how counterparties. Like there'll be people probably doing the heavy lifting on the statistics, on the programming, but you need to have some feeling. So they find it very constraining when I tell them, look, this is a scientific, this is a STEM paper poster format that's very, very common. And can you express themselves? And they feel very constrained because they're more comfortable. Like, can I just write a paper? And initially we did that, but like I said, forcing them into this gives them an experience that they'll never have anywhere else.
Yeah, but I agree
we
with
do
you.
agree.
The analysis is always disappointing. And the question is, how do we blend that? How do we blend an understanding of language and how it works? And, we only have 2 courses essentially to teach students all of this. So yeah, I mean, it's incredibly, but to me, it's even more, we need even more skill in it, right? It just shows.
That is something, that's a great.
Yeah. Brad, the other Brad.
Sure, actually, I have a question for each of you. Actually, I was going to ask Catherine is, with the sentiment analysis that you were doing and all the great books, and then you also go and teach those same great books, did the sentiment analysis influence you or bias you in your teaching, or just reinforce what you are already teaching?
There are sometimes things that I think about different. I would say I now understand the role of emotion is far more important than I ever thought in terms of how a text is working. So I would say, but in terms of, what we actually ask is for students before they do a novel to draw what they think it is, because that really helps them see what's different, why it's different. Yes, there are times when, for example, we tend to think of Freytag's pyramid, which is this pyramid-like structure about how all narrative works. And it's really helped me move beyond that. And the perfect example is Augustine's Confessions, where he's working up to try to convert. And I've always thought of that as climbing a mountain, right? He's climbing the mountain, he's trying to get to the top to convert. And in fact, he's fallen into a hole. And the moment right before he converts is the absolute lowest hole of the entire narrative emotionally. And I had just always viewed it in these kind of traditional Freytag pyramids. So I would say there are times when I'm surprised. I was completely shocked that Nabokov's text is essentially almost mirror images. That blew my mind, right? I had never, and then even the 2 low points in one, somebody is walking into a water to die, and in the other, a character is looking into water, sees his reflection, and goes on to live. So even the moments that are mirror moments thematically. So that's the other thing is often it's I don't know, a lot, I'm rambling, but yes, I mean, it's
And a lot of times it's false leads.
sometimes things are surfaced that are just plain wrong. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And I also had a question for John, since I also have a startup, Silicon Valley funded, blah, blah, blah stuff. But I deal with a lot of knowledge workers that have to manage IT engineers and very, very technical people. And one of the things I like to tell them is you don't have to know everything about the technology. In fact, you shouldn't, because once you do, you lose your skills from being a knowledge worker. But you do have to know just enough. And that's what I like about this program. You need to know just enough. And what I tell them is they need to know when to throw the bullshit flag, because the technical people, I'm a technical person. I'm going to say a whole bunch of words at you that you aren't going to understand. And you as the knowledge worker can go, he knows what they're doing. Good. All right, let's go on. And it was bullshit, like they said. So, that's one of the things I try to help my knowledge workers get over, is the fact that they do need to know some of these things.
Yeah, and I tell them that there are tremendous opportunities for people that can bridge the gap, who can bring kind of the strength of a Kenyon traditional humanities, small liberal arts education to that forum, because I'm sure it's gotten better. I've certainly seen that kind of in some of the hiring practices, but it was pretty sparse when I was there. Maybe it was a group I was working with, a bunch of theoretical physicists and Caltech programmers.
Very good.
Other questions? Well, it's been such a pleasure. I'm sorry we tricked you with the AI. That was mean of us. And yeah, thank you so much for coming and listening to what we are doing. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate
Yes,
it.
yes.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night,
Wonderful.
everybody.
Good
That
night.
was great. Thank you so much.
Thank
Mhm.
you.